The words hit me like shrapnel when my mother-in-law, Helen, stood in my own living room and declared, "You can sleep on the couch. Marcus needs proper rest." The audacity of it stole my breath as I stared at this woman who just told a combat veteran where she could sleep in the house she bought with her own blood, sweat, and VA benefits. 3 years I'd served overseas, dodging IEDs and mortar fire. 2 years I'd spent rebuilding my life after coming home broken. But nothing had prepared me for the war Helen Thompson was waging against me in my own home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sophia Rivera, but everyone calls me Sophie. Staff Sergeant Rivera to the Marines I served with in Afghanistan. The woman standing in my Austin living room that humid July evening had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a 29-year-old with PTSD and a slight limp from shrapnel damage. What she missed was the steel spine that 3 tours of duty had forged and the tactical mind that had kept my unit alive through some of the deadliest missions in Helmand Province. The house we stood in, my house, was a modest 3-bedroom ranch in Cedar Park. Nothing fancy, but clean and comfortable. I'd bought it with my VA loan 2 years after coming home, when I finally felt stable enough to put down roots. The mortgage payments came from my disability compensation and my job at the Veterans Counseling Center downtown. Every square inch of this place represented my fight to build something normal after the chaos of war. Helen Thompson had been visiting for what was supposed to be a long weekend. It was now day 12. 12 days of her rearranging my kitchen cabinets, criticizing my housekeeping, and treating me like a guest in my own home. 12 days of watching my husband Marcus transform from the supportive partner I'd married into a nodding puppet who jumped every time his mother snapped her fingers. "Helen," I said, my voice carefully controlled the way Sergeant Martinez had taught us during hostage negotiation training. "This is my house. If anyone's sleeping on the couch, it won't be me." She turned from where she'd been folding Marcus's laundry I had already folded and put away that morning, and fixed me with the condescending smile I'd come to know too well. "Oh, sweetheart, you've had such a hard time adjusting since you came back from that war business. The least I can do is help Marcus get the rest he needs to take care of you." That war business. As if 3 tours in Afghanistan was a hobby I'd picked up. As if the shrapnel scars on my left leg and the nightmares that still woke me some nights were just quirky personality traits. As if the 23 soldiers who didn't make it home were just statistics in my war business. Marcus appeared in the doorway holding a beer, his work shirt rumpled, and his expression already apologetic before he'd even heard what was happening. This was the man I'd fallen in love with 2 years ago at a veteran support group barbecue. Back then, he'd been fascinated by my stories, proud to introduce me as his girlfriend who'd served her country. He'd hold my hand during fireworks displays when the sounds triggered flashbacks, and he'd never once made me feel broken. "What's going on?" he asked, though his eyes were already seeking his mother's approval rather than mine. "Your mother just told me to sleep on the couch," I said flatly. Marcus's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, embarrassment, calculation. I watched him choose his mother's comfort over his wife's dignity in real time. "Sophie, you know Mom's back's been bothering her. Maybe just for tonight?" "No." The word came out sharp enough to cut glass. "Absolutely not." Helen's smile widened, the way a predator's might when it senses weakness. "Marcus, honey, perhaps you should explain to Sophie how things work in a proper household. When family visits, we make accommodations." Family visits. She'd been here nearly 2 weeks, had reorganized my spice rack without permission, thrown away my comfortable combat boots because they were unsightly, and had the audacity to schedule a dinner party at my house without consulting me. This wasn't a visit, it was an invasion. "Sophie," Marcus said, and I could hear the pleading in his voice, "can we just talk about this?" "We can talk. But we'll talk about why your mother thinks she can decide sleeping arrangements in a house she doesn't own, doesn't pay for, and wasn't invited to stay in for 2 weeks. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Helen's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline, while Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself last spring. I think that Helen said slowly, is having one of her episodes. Episodes. That's what she called it whenever I stood up for myself. According to Helen Thompson, any sign of backbone for me was evidence of my war trauma making me unstable. Never mind that I'd been through extensive therapy, that I held down a demanding job counseling other veterans, that I'd built a stable life from nothing. The moment I disagreed with her, I was having an episode.
"This isn't an episode," I said, feeling the familiar calm that settled over me in high-stress situations. It was the same feeling I'd had during firefights. Crystal clear focus, every detail sharp and important. This is me setting a boundary in my own home. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Sophie, maybe we should all just calm down." I am calm, but I want to be very clear about something. Helen, you are a guest in my house. Guests don't rearrange furniture, don't throw away their host's belongings, and they certainly don't decide where the homeowner sleeps. Helen's mask of sweet concern was beginning to slip, revealing something harder underneath. "Marcus, I think you need to consider whether Sophie is really ready for the responsibilities of marriage, this kind of hostility toward family. Stop." The command in my voice made both of them freeze. Years of leading soldiers had taught me how to project authority when necessary. "You will not psychoanalyze me, you will not question my fitness for marriage, and you will not speak about me like I'm not standing right here." For the first time since I'd known her, Helen Thompson looked genuinely surprised. She had been testing my boundaries for months, pushing little by little to see how much I'd tolerate. Tonight, she'd finally found the line. Marcus looked between us like a man watching two trains heading for a collision. "Maybe Mom should head back to Dallas tomorrow," he said weakly. "Maybe she should head back tonight," I countered. Helen's laugh was brittle like winter ice. "Well, I can certainly see where I'm not wanted. Marcus, I hope you'll remember who's been taking care of this family for 32 years when you're dealing with the consequences of this marriage." She swept from the room like a queen in exile, leaving Marcus and me staring at each other across a suddenly vast distance. In that moment, I realized that the woman I just confronted wasn't just an overbearing mother-in-law. She was a strategist, and tonight's performance had been carefully calculated. The real question was, what was her endgame? As Helen's bedroom door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows, I found myself wondering if I'd just won a battle or walked directly into a trap. In Afghanistan, we'd learned that the most dangerous enemies were the ones who made you think you were winning right up until the moment they destroyed you. Looking at Marcus's conflicted face, I had the sinking feeling that Helen Thompson was exactly that kind of enemy.
The next morning, Helen was gone before I woke up, leaving behind only a perfectly made guest bed and a passive-aggressive thank you note on the kitchen counter. "Thank you for your hospitality, Sophie. I hope you find the peace you're looking for." The subtext was clear. I was the problem, the unstable one, the reason for family discord. Marcus found me reading the note over my morning coffee, still in my old Marine Corps PT shirt and shorts. The shirt had holes from years of wear, but it was comfortable, familiar. A reminder of who I was before Helen Thompson made me question everything about myself. "She left early," he said, pouring himself coffee with the careful movements of someone trying not to set off a landmine. Wanted to beat the traffic. I nodded, waiting to see if he'd address what had happened the night before. Instead, he grabbed his laptop and settled at the kitchen table, already retreating into work emails. This was Marcus's pattern now. Avoidance wrapped in busyness. It hadn't always been this way. When we first met at that barbecue 2 years ago, Marcus Thompson had been different. confident without being arrogant, funny without being cruel. He worked as an IT project manager for a tech company downtown, had his own apartment, his own life. He'd approached me while I was helping Danny Walsh, my Marine buddy, flip burgers at the grill. "You're the staff sergeant Danny keeps talking about," he'd said, offering me a beer. "The one who kept everyone alive in Helmand." I'd been surprised he knew my rank, more surprised that Danny had been talking about me. "Just did my job," I'd said, the standard response. "Danny says you carried a wounded soldier 2 miles through enemy territory to a medevac point. That's not just doing your job, that's being a hero." Most people either treated my service like something to pity or something to worship. Marcus treated it like what it was, a job I'd done well under impossible circumstances. He asked intelligent questions about military logistics, listened when I talked about the challenges of transitioning to civilian life, never once made me feel like a victim or a symbol. Our courtship had been refreshingly normal. Dinner dates where we talked about books and movies, weekend trips to South Pedro Island where he didn't flinch at my scars or make a big deal about my nightmares. When I told him about my PTSD diagnosis, he'd simply ask what he could do to help. "Just be patient with me," I'd said. "Some days are harder than others." "We all have hard days," he'd replied. "That's what partnership is for." 6 months in, he'd met Danny and my small circle of veteran friends. He'd fit in naturally, never trying too hard or asking inappropriate questions about combat. When Danny's daughter graduated from high school, Marcus had volunteered to help set up chairs for the party. When Lisa's husband deployed, Marcus was the one to suggest we help her move to a smaller apartment. The first crack appeared when he introduced me to his family at Thanksgiving. Helen Thompson had arrived at the restaurant like a queen granting an audience, air kissing my cheeks while her eyes cataloged everything from my simple black dress to my minimal makeup. "So, you're the soldier Marcus has been telling us about," she'd said, making soldier sound like stripper. "Marine," I'd corrected automatically. "Of course. And what do you do now that you're back?" The pause before back hung in the air like smoke, as if my return from deployment was some kind of failure rather than the completion of my service contract. "I'm a counselor at the Veterans Affairs Office. I help other veterans transition to civilian life." Helen's smile had been perfectly practiced. "How noble. It must be so rewarding to help people with their problems." The dinner had continued in that vein. Helen asking questions that sounded supportive, but felt like interrogations. What was my family background? Where had I grown up? What were my long-term career plans? Each answer seemed to disappoint her more than the last. My father had been a mechanic, my mother a school secretary. I'd grown up in a small town outside San Antonio, joined the Marines straight out of high school because college wasn't financially feasible. My long-term plans involved potentially returning to school for a master's degree in psychology, maybe opening my own practice someday. "How ambitious," Helen had said in a tone that suggested the opposite. Marcus was different after that dinner. Not dramatically, just careful. He started explaining my background to people before I could introduce myself. "Sophie's a veteran. She's been through a lot." As if my service was something to excuse rather than respect. When Helen visited for the first time 6 months after we'd married, the changes became more pronounced. Marcus jumped to accommodate her every whim, rearranged our weekend plans around her preferences, deferred to her opinions on everything from restaurant choices to home decor. "Your mother has strong opinions," I'd said, after she had suggested we replace our comfortable sectional with something more elegant. "She just wants what's best for us. She has good taste." The second visit had been worse. Helen had arrived with paint samples and fabric swatches, ready to help us redecorate. She'd critique my cooking, my housekeeping, my choice to keep my maiden name professionally. When I had pushed back, Marcus had taken her side. "Sophie, she's just trying to help. You're being defensive." Defensive, another word that Helen had introduced to Marcus's vocabulary, along with sensitive, difficult, and unstable. Suddenly, every disagreement I had with his mother was evidence of my psychological problems rather than legitimate concerns about boundaries. The third visit had been when Helen started the episodes narrative. I'd objected to her throwing away my favorite coffee mug, a battered metal cup I'd carried through 3 deployments. It wasn't pretty, but it had sentimental value. Sophie's having one of her episodes, Helen had explained to Marcus, as if I wasn't standing right there. The trauma makes her attached to objects. It's quite common. Marcus had nodded along, buying into the amateur psychology session. The coffee mug had stayed in the trash. Now, sitting across from my husband as he buried himself in work emails, I realized that Helen's campaign had been more successful than I had initially understood. She hadn't just been criticizing me, she'd been systematically undermining my marriage, turning Marcus against me, one small manipulation at a time. "We need to talk about last night," I said, closing his laptop. Marcus sighed, the sound of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Sophie, you really embarrassed her. She was just trying to help with the sleeping arrangements." "Stop." I held up a hand. "Before you finish that sentence, I want you to think very carefully about what you're about to say, because you're about to tell me that your mother's comfort is more important than your wife's dignity in her own home." Marcus's jaw tightened. "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe you could have handled it better. Mom's not used to being talked to you like that." There it was. The real issue wasn't Helen's behavior, it was my reaction to it. In Marcus's worldview, I was supposed to absorb her disrespect with a smile, grateful for whatever crumbs of acceptance she might throw my way. How should I have handled it, Marcus? Should I have thanked her for the privilege of sleeping on my own couch? You're being dramatic. Dramatic. Another Helen word. I felt something cold settle in my chest, the same feeling I'd had in Afghanistan when intelligence reports suggested we were walking into an ambush. "I'm being clear," I said. "Your mother disrespected me in my own home, and instead of supporting your wife, you're making excuses for her behavior." Marcus stood up abruptly, grabbing his laptop. "I can't do this right now. I have a conference call in 10 minutes. He left me sitting alone in the kitchen, Helen's note still in my hand. For the first time since coming home from Afghanistan, I felt truly isolated. In the Marines, you knew who had your back. In marriage, apparently, that was negotiable. As I threw Helen's note in the trash, I found myself thinking about something my old platoon sergeant used to say. "Rivera, the enemy isn't always the one shooting at you. Sometimes it's the one whispering poison in your commander's ear." Helen Thompson wasn't shooting at me. She was doing something far more dangerous. She was turning my own husband into a weapon against me.
3 weeks after Helen's dramatic exit, I thought we might finally have some peace. I was wrong. If anything, her influence had grown stronger in her absence, like a toxin that continues working long after the initial dose. Marcus had become a different person, entirely. He criticized everything, my cooking, my cleaning, even my work schedule at the Veterans Center. Mom mentioned that most wives are home by 5, he'd say when I worked late with a veteran in crisis, as if Helen's arbitrary timeline mattered more than someone contemplating suicide. The phone calls started 2 days after she left. Every evening at exactly 7 a.m., Helen would call Marcus to check in. These weren't brief conversations. They lasted an hour or more, during which Marcus would pace our living room like a caged animal, hanging on her every word. "She's worried about us," he'd explained when I asked about the marathon phone sessions. "She thinks the stress of your transition is affecting our marriage." My transition? As if I was the problem, not the woman who'd spent 2 weeks systematically dismantling our relationship from the inside? The first package arrived on a Tuesday. I found it on our doorstep when I got home from work. A large box addressed to both of us with Helen's return address. inside were self-help books with titles like Healing from Military Trauma and Supporting Your PTSD Spouse. All of them bookmarked at specific chapters about managing aggressive episodes and creating safe spaces. Marcus found me flipping through one of the books in disgust. "She's just trying to help," he said, taking the book from my hands. "Maybe we should read some of these together." "Marcus, I've been through extensive therapy. I have a degree in psychology. I don't need your mother's amateur analysis of my mental health." "See, this is exactly what she's talking about. You get defensive whenever anyone tries to help." Defensive. There was that word again, Helen's favorite weapon. According to her amateur diagnosis, any pushback from me was evidence of psychological instability rather than reasonable self-advocacy. The second package contained home improvement magazines, all featuring articles about creating harmony in your living space and design choices that promote mental wellness. Helen had helpfully highlighted suggestions about neutral colors, minimal decorations, and the importance of calming environments for stressed individuals. My house was already neutral and calming. What it wasn't was a sterile showplace designed to impress visitors. I had photos from my deployment, a flag that had flown over our forward operating base, and yes, some military memorabilia that meant something to me. According to Helen's highlighted articles, these were triggering elements that needed to be removed. "Maybe she has a point," Marcus said, studying a picture of a beige living room that looked like a hotel lobby. "Some of this military stuff might be bringing up bad memories." "Those aren't bad memories," I said, gesturing to the shadow box containing my medals and unit patches. "They're part of my history, part of who I am." "But if they're causing problems..." "The only problem is your mother trying to erase my identity one piece at a time." Marcus set down the magazine with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. "Sophie, you're reading too much into this. She's trying to help us create a peaceful home." Peaceful for whom? Helen had never lived through mortar attacks or watched friends die. She had no idea what real trauma looked like, but she'd appointed herself the expert on my psychological well-being. The third package was the one that made me realize how carefully Helen was building her case. It contained printouts of articles about secondary trauma in military families and the challenges of loving someone with PTSD. Every article painted the military spouse as a victim of their partner's instability, suffering in silence while trying to manage an unpredictable, potentially dangerous situation. One article was particularly insidious: When to Seek Professional Intervention for Your PTSD Spouse. Helen had highlighted sections about escalating aggression, unreasonable demands for control, and isolation from family support systems. The checklist of warning signs read like a description of our recent conflicts, as if Helen had reverse-engineered our arguments to fit a diagnostic framework. "Marcus," I said, holding up the printouts, "do you see what she's doing? She's not helping. She's building a narrative that paints me as dangerous and unstable." He glanced at the papers but didn't really read them. "Sophie, paranoia is actually listed as one of the symptoms." "I'm not paranoid." The words came out sharper than I intended, and I saw Marcus flinch. Another point for Helen's side. The unpredictable outbursts, box checked. That night, I called Danny Walsh. We'd served together in Afghanistan, and he'd become something like a big brother to me over the years. Danny had his own struggles with PTSD, but he'd built a stable life with his wife Carmen and their 2 kids. More importantly, he understood the unique challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life.
"She's playing psychological warfare," Danny said after I'd explained the situation. "Classic manipulation tactics. Isolate the target, control the narrative, turn allies against them." "But why? What does she gain from destroying my marriage?" "Control," Danny said simply. "She had total control over Marcus before you came along. Now she's getting it back by making him choose between supporting his wife or managing his unstable spouse." Danny was right. Helen wasn't just trying to improve our relationship. She was systematically destroying it while positioning herself as the solution to the problems she'd created. The breaking point came 3 days later when I discovered Marcus had been keeping a journal. He'd left it open on his nightstand, either by accident or because some part of him wanted me to see it. The entries detailed every argument we'd had, every time I'd overreacted to his mother's suggestions, every instance where I'd shown what he now called military rigidity. The final entry was dated the night before. Sophie's episodes are getting worse. Mom was right about the stress affecting our marriage. Maybe we need professional help, or maybe this marriage was a mistake. I sat on the edge of our bed reading my husband's private thoughts about our relationship and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't about Helen's visits or her inappropriate suggestions anymore. This was about my husband documenting evidence for what felt like an inevitable divorce, building a case that would paint me as the unstable veteran who couldn't handle civilian life. In Afghanistan, we had a saying, when you're taking flak, you're over the target. Helen's escalating campaign meant I was close to something she desperately wanted to protect. But what? I thought about the house, my house, bought with my VA benefits and disability compensation, the stable income from my job at the Veterans Center, the small inheritance I'd received from my grandmother, which I'd never mentioned to Marcus in detail, the life insurance policy that would provide for a surviving spouse. Suddenly, Helen's strategy made perfect sense. She wasn't just trying to control Marcus. She was trying to position him to inherit everything I'd built while making me look too unstable to object. That night, as Marcus slept beside me, I made a decision. Helen Thompson wanted to play psychological warfare? Fine. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She was fighting someone who'd been trained by the best military minds in the world. It was time to show her what a real tactical operation looked like.
The first rule of military intelligence: know your enemy better than they know themselves. I'd been reactive for too long, letting Helen set the terms of engagement. That ended now. I started with what any good intelligence officer would do. I gathered data. While Marcus was at work, I went through every document in our house, photographing bank statements, insurance policies, property deeds, and tax returns. What I found made my blood run cold. Marcus had taken out a life insurance policy on me 6 months ago, a policy I'd never signed or agreed to. The beneficiary was listed as estate, which in our state meant it would go to my surviving spouse. $500,000 that Helen would effectively control through her influence over Marcus. There was more. Marcus had been researching Texas divorce laws, specifically focusing on cases involving mentally unstable spouses and property division. His browser history showed searches for PTSD and marriage dissolution, protecting assets from unstable spouse, and, most damning of all, involuntary psychiatric commitment procedures. The picture was becoming clear. Helen wasn't just trying to break up our marriage. She was building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent so Marcus could control my assets and benefits. The veterans' disability payments, the house, the life insurance, my small but growing savings account, it all added up to a significant sum that would be Helen's to manage through her puppet son. I photographed everything, uploaded the files to a secure cloud account, and began phase 2 of my reconnaissance, understanding Helen's financial situation. A quick search of public records revealed that Helen Thompson wasn't as wealthy as she pretended to be. Her late husband had left substantial debts from a failed business venture. The big house in Dallas was mortgaged to the hilt, and she'd been making minimum payments on multiple credit cards for years. Her comfortable lifestyle was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. Suddenly, her interest in Marcus's marriage made perfect sense. She needed money, and her son's unstable veteran wife represented a potential windfall if she could just prove I was too mentally ill to manage my own affairs. That evening, I called my friend Zoe Campbell. We'd met in a veteran support group, and she now worked as a private investigator, specializing in domestic cases. More importantly, she understood the unique challenges that female veterans faced in civilian relationships. "I need a professional opinion," I told her, explaining Helen's campaign without mentioning my suspicions about the financial motives. Am I overreacting, or is this as calculated as it feels? Zoe was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Sophie, what you're describing is textbook psychological abuse. The isolation, the gaslighting, the systematic undermining of your credibility. This woman is following a playbook. But why? What's the end game? Money, usually. Or control. Sometimes both. Zoe paused. Have you checked your financial records lately? Insurance policies, bank accounts, property deeds, and tax returns? I told her what I'd found, and Zoe's response was immediate and alarming. Sophie, you need to document everything and get legal advice today. This isn't just marital problems. This is fraud in progress. That night, I lay awake listening to Marcus breathe beside me and realized I was sharing a bed with someone who was actively plotting against me. The man who'd once held me during nightmares was now documenting those same nightmares as evidence of my instability. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and drove to a law office downtown. Patricia Gonzalez specialized in veteran affairs and domestic disputes, and her initial consultation was free for veteran families. Mrs. Rivera, she said, reviewing the documents I'd brought, this is one of the most systematic attempts at financial manipulation I've seen. The unauthorized life insurance policy alone could be grounds for fraud charges. She leaned back in her chair, studying me with sharp eyes. But I have to ask, are you prepared for what fighting this will mean? Because once you take action, there's no going back. Your marriage will effectively be over. I thought about the man Marcus had become, the stranger who documented every reaction for his mother's approval. I think it's already over. I just didn't want to admit it. Patricia nodded. So, let's talk strategy. First, we freeze all joint accounts and put holds on any policies or assets. Second, we document every instance of harassment and manipulation. Third, we prepare for the inevitable psychological evaluation they'll demand. Psychological evaluation? They'll claim you're mentally unfit to make decisions about your own finances or property. It's a common tactic in these cases. The good news is that you're already in therapy, you have a stable work history, and you've been managing your PTSD successfully for years. Their case is built on manipulation, not medical evidence. I left Patricia's office feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. For the first time since Helen's campaign began, I wasn't just defending myself, I was taking offensive action.
That afternoon, I stopped by Danny's garage where he worked as a mechanic. I needed someone who understood military tactics to help me plan my next moves. "You're in a fight for your life," Danny said after I'd brought him up to speed. "But you've got advantages they don't know about. You're trained for this kind of conflict, and they're not." "What do you mean?" "They think you're some broken veteran who can't handle confrontation. They have no idea they're dealing with a Marine staff sergeant who led troops through combat zones." Danny grinned. Time to remind them who they're messing with. Danny was right. Helen had been treating me like a victim because that's how she saw me, a damaged woman who could be easily manipulated and controlled. She had no idea that my military training had taught me patience, strategy, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. More importantly, she didn't know that Marines are trained to never leave a fallen comrade behind. And right now, the woman I used to be, the confident, strong person I'd been before Helen's campaign, was lying wounded on the battlefield of my own life. It was time for a rescue mission. That evening, Marcus came home to find me cooking dinner, as usual, acting like nothing had changed. I smiled, asked about his day, and listened to him complain about a difficult client. I was the picture of domestic normalcy. He had no idea that I'd spent the day gathering intelligence, building a legal strategy, and preparing for war. "Helen called today. She's planning another visit next month. She wants to bring some friends to meet you, people who've helped other military families with similar situations." "Similar situations?" "You know, marriages dealing with PTSD challenges. She thinks it might help to talk to other couples who've worked through these issues." I nodded and smiled, even as I mentally added this new information to my intelligence file. Helen Thompson wanted to bring witnesses to document my breakdown. Perfect. I'd give her something worth documenting.
The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in military discipline. During the day, I played the role of the struggling veteran wife, carefully documenting every interaction while maintaining the facade Helen expected. At night, I built my case with the methodical precision of an intelligence analyst. My first stop was Dr. Amanda Foster, my therapist at the Veterans Center. I'd been seeing her for routine maintenance therapy since my discharge, but now I needed something more strategic. Amanda, I need you to document our sessions very carefully for the next few weeks, I told her during my appointment. Someone's trying to build a case that I'm mentally unstable and I need professional evidence to the contrary. Dr. Foster frowned as I explained Helen's campaign. Sophie, what you're describing sounds like psychological abuse designed to trigger PTSD symptoms. Have you been experiencing any regression? Some increased anxiety, trouble sleeping when Marcus is on those long phone calls with his mother, but I've been using the coping strategies we've worked on. Good. I'll document that despite increased stressors, you're managing your symptoms appropriately and maintaining stable functioning. She made notes in my file. I'll also note that the stressors appear to be external and manipulative rather than random triggers. My next ally was unexpected. Helen Thompson, Marcus's younger sister, called me out of the blue on a Thursday evening while Marcus was working late. Sophie, we need to talk, she said without preamble. Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow? Somewhere Mom won't see us. I met Rachel at a small cafe near the university where she taught art history. She looked nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder like she expected Helen to materialize from behind a potted plant. I know what Mom's doing to you, she said quietly. She did the same thing to Marcus's last girlfriend, Sarah. This was news to me. Marcus had mentioned dating someone before me, but never provided details about why it ended. What happened to Sarah? Rachel stirred her coffee absently. She was a nurse, really sweet girl. Mom started the same campaign, found fault with everything, made Marcus question the relationship, sent those passive-aggressive care packages full of self-help books. And Rachel stirred her coffee absently. She eventually had a breakdown at a family dinner, started crying, said she couldn't take the constant criticism anymore. Mom immediately swooped in to comfort Marcus, told him Sarah was obviously too unstable for a serious relationship, and Marcus broke up with her the next week. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't Helen's first rodeo. She'd successfully destroyed at least one relationship before mine using the exact same playbook. Why didn't you warn me earlier? I tried to hint at things, but I was afraid to say anything directly. Mom controls the family finances, pays for my graduate school. If she cut me off, she shrugged helplessly. But watching her do this to you, especially after your military service, I can't stay quiet anymore. Rachel provided something invaluable, confirmation that Helen's behavior was a pattern, not a reaction to me specifically. She also agreed to secretly document any conversations she had with Helen about me, creating a record of Helen's manipulation from inside the family circle. Meanwhile, Zoe Campbell was conducting her own investigation into Helen's background. What she found painted an even more disturbing picture than I had initially suspected. Your mother-in-law has done this before, Zoe reported during our clandestine meeting at a diner across town. Not just with Marcus's ex-girlfriend. I found records of her interfering in her late husband's business relationships, systematically isolating him from partners and advisors who questioned her involvement. What happened? The business failed within 2 years of her taking an active role. The partners she'd driven away later said she'd created such a toxic environment that nobody wanted to work with the company anymore. Zoe slid a folder across the table. She's a textbook narcissist with sociopathic tendencies. She destroys relationships for sport. The folder contained newspaper clippings about the business failure, court documents resulting from the resulting lawsuits, and, most damning of all, a restraining order that Helen's former daughter-in-law had filed against her before eventually moving across the country. She's been perfecting these tactics, I realized. And she's good at it. She knows how to stay just shy of illegal harassment while making her targets look like the unstable ones. Zoe closed the folder. But here's the thing. She's never faced someone with your training and resources before.
While I was building my intelligence network, Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic. The evening phone calls with Helen had extended to include video chats, during which I could hear them discussing my daily activities in hushed tones. Marcus had started photographing our house, claiming he was documenting the improvements we'd made. But I suspected the real purpose was creating evidence for Helen's case about my unstable living environment. The most unsettling development was Marcus's new habit of recording our conversations. He'd started leaving his phone open on the counter during arguments, positioned just right to capture my voice. When I called him on it, he claimed he was just checking messages, but the timing was too consistent to be coincidental. He's gathering evidence, Patricia confirmed when I showed her photos of Marcus's recording setup. This supports our theory that they're building a case for psychological incompetence. We need to be very careful about how you respond to provocations. What do you mean? They're trying to capture you losing your temper, having what they'll call an episode. Every argument, every moment of frustration, every time you defend yourself, they're documenting it as evidence of instability. This revelation changed my entire approach. Instead of engaging in arguments, I started responding to Marcus's provocations with calm questions. When he criticized my housekeeping, I asked for specific suggestions for improvement. When he questioned my work schedule, I offered to show him my calendar. When he brought up Helen's concerns about my episodes, I suggested we attend couples counseling together. My measured responses clearly frustrated him. He'd try to escalate conflicts, but I'd respond with either military-level calm or strategic withdrawal. "You're right, Marcus, let me think about that," became my standard response to his increasingly desperate attempts to provoke me. The effect was remarkable. Without me providing the emotional reactions he expected, Marcus began to unravel. He started having actual outbursts, slamming doors, raising his voice, storming out of the house. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to document my instability, he was creating evidence of his own. 2 weeks before Helen's scheduled visit, I made my final preparation. I installed a comprehensive security system throughout the house, including audio recording capabilities in every room. If Helen wanted to document behavior, I'd make sure to capture everything, including her own actions and words. I also opened a separate bank account and began transferring my disability payments and salary into it. Patricia had advised me to protect my assets before Helen's visit, anticipating that they might try to freeze accounts or claim financial incompetence. The night before Helen's arrival, I stood in my kitchen in my house, bought with my benefits, and felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't experienced since my military days. It was the same feeling I'd had before dangerous missions in Afghanistan: absolute clarity of purpose, complete confidence in my preparation, and the unshakable knowledge that I was fighting for something worth defending. Marcus found me there, making coffee and humming softly to myself. "You seem different," he said cautiously. I smiled at him, the same smile I'd worn while leading soldiers through hostile territory. "Just looking forward to your mother's visit. I think it's going to be very educational." As I watched confusion flicker across his face, I realized that tomorrow wouldn't just be about defending myself from Helen's attacks. It would be about revealing the truth of who she really was, not just to Marcus, but to the witnesses she was bringing to validate her narrative. Helen Thompson had spent months preparing for battle against a broken veteran. Instead, she was about to face a combat-ready Marine who'd finally stopped playing defense.
Helen arrived on Friday afternoon with an entourage that would have made a general proud. She'd brought 3 other women, each introduced with titles that sounded impressive but meant nothing. Margaret Hartley, Family Dynamics Specialist; Dr. Linda Walsh, Trauma Recovery Consultant; and Jennifer Stone, Domestic Stability Advisor. None of them had actual credentials in psychology or social work, as I had verified through online searches the night before. Margaret sold real estate, Linda was a retired high school counselor, and Jennifer ran a home organization business. They were Helen's friends playing dress-up as experts, brought in to provide an audience for my anticipated breakdown. Sophie, darling! Helen air-kissed my cheeks while her entourage assessed my home with critical eyes. I'm so excited for you to meet these wonderful women. They've helped so many military families work through challenging transitions. How thoughtful, I replied, my voice warm and welcoming. Please come in. I've prepared refreshments in the living room. I led them to the space I'd carefully staged for this performance. Fresh flowers, perfectly arranged magazines, my military commendations displayed prominently on the mantel alongside photos of my unit in Afghanistan. Everything screamed stable, successful veteran rather than the unstable victim they expected to find. Margaret's eyes lingered on my Purple Heart citation. My, such an impressive display. Marcus mentioned you've had some difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Every veteran faces adjustment challenges, I replied smoothly. That's why I work at the Veterans Counseling Center, to help others navigate the transition I've successfully completed myself. I watched Helen's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the response she'd coached her friends to expect. Dr. Linda leaned forward with practiced concern. Helen's told us about some concerning episodes, outbursts, paranoid thinking, difficulty maintaining relationships. These are common symptoms we see in combat veterans. I'm curious, I said, settling into my chair with the relaxed confidence of someone in complete control. What specific training do you have in diagnosing PTSD or other combat-related conditions? Linda blinked, clearly not expecting to have her credentials questioned. Well, I have extensive experience working with troubled individuals. In what capacity? Are you a licensed therapist, psychiatrist, or clinical social worker? The silence stretched uncomfortably as Linda realized she'd been caught playing doctor without a license. Helen jumped in to rescue her. Sophie, dear, there's no need to be so defensive. We're all here to help. I'm not being defensive. I'm being thorough. In my experience, it's important to verify the qualifications of anyone offering mental health advice. I smiled pleasantly. I'm sure you understand, given your concern for my well-being. Round 1 to me. Helen's carefully chosen witnesses were already looking uncertain, realizing they'd been brought to evaluate someone far more competent than they'd been led to believe. Marcus arrived home from work during this initial skirmish, and I watched him assess the room dynamics with growing confusion. His mother had promised him a showcase of my instability, but instead he found me calmly hosting tea like a diplomat receiving foreign dignitaries. "How's everyone doing?" he asked, kissing my cheek in a gesture that felt more like performance than affection. "Wonderfully," I said. "Your mother's friends have been sharing their insights about veteran families. I've been learning so much about their perspectives." Over dinner, Helen began her main offensive. She'd clearly briefed her allies on specific talking points designed to trigger defensive responses from me. "Sophie," Jennifer said, with false sympathy, "Marcus mentioned you've been having trouble with household management. That must be so frustrating for someone used to military order." "Actually, I find civilian life quite manageable," I replied, gesturing around our immaculate dining room. "Military training teaches excellent organizational skills that translate well to domestic life." Margaret tried next. "What about the anger issues? Helen mentioned there have been some concerning outbursts." "I'm curious what specific incidents you're referring to," I said, looking directly at Helen. "Could you give me an example of an anger outburst you've witnessed?" Helen's eyes narrowed as she realized the trap. Any specific example would be something I could easily refute, while vague accusations made her look like she was spreading unfounded rumors. "Well, there was the incident with the sleeping arrangements." "You mean when you told me to sleep on my own couch in the house I own?" I interrupted gently. I can see how standing up for basic respect in my own home might be misinterpreted as an outburst. The table fell silent. Helen's witnesses exchanged glances, clearly not having heard this version of events. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, probably realizing how his mother's demand sounded when stated plainly.
Dr. Linda attempted to regain control of the narrative. Sometimes military personnel have difficulty distinguishing between appropriate civilian responses and combat-level reactions. It's a common adjustment issue. That's an interesting theory, I said. What's your experience with combat veterans specifically? Well, I've read extensively about the subject. Have you ever been in combat yourself? Worked directly with active duty military? Completed any formal training in military psychology? Linda's face reddened. No, but then perhaps you should be careful about making assumptions based on limited civilian perspectives about experiences you haven't had. The room's energy had shifted completely. Instead of cornering an unstable veteran, Helen's team found themselves being systematically dismantled by someone with superior tactical skills and unshakable composure. Helen made one final desperate play. Sophie, this defensiveness is exactly what we're concerned about. Can't you see how your military training is making it difficult for you to accept help from people who care about you? I set down my water glass and looked directly at her, my voice remaining calm but carrying the unmistakable authority I'd once used to command Marines in combat zones. Helen, let me be very clear about something. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, led soldiers through some of the most dangerous territory on Earth, and earned commendations for my service to this country. I completed my military obligations with honor, transitioned successfully to civilian life, built a career helping other veterans, and purchased this home with benefits I earned through my sacrifice. I paused, letting my words sink in while maintaining eye contact. What I haven't done is allow anyone to disrespect me in my own home, question my mental fitness without cause, or manipulate my marriage for their own purposes. If you interpret basic self-respect as mental instability, that says far more about your understanding of healthy boundaries than it does about my psychological state. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret, Linda, and Jennifer looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. Marcus stared at his plate, finally seeing his mother's campaign for what it really was. Helen's mask of concerned mother-in-law was slipping, revealing something much uglier underneath. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for her wine glass, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of desperation. "Well," she said, forcing a brittle laugh, "I can see we have our work cut out for us." But I could see in her eyes that she knew the truth. She'd brought witnesses to document my breakdown, and instead, they'd witness her own. After Helen's witnesses retreated to the guest bedrooms with their tails between their legs, I knew the real battle was just beginning. A cornered predator is at its most dangerous, and Helen Thompson was nothing if not a skilled predator. I didn't have to wait long for her next move. At 2:30 a.m., I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass from downstairs. My military training kicked in immediately. I slipped out of bed, grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet, and moved silently through the house to investigate. I found Helen in the kitchen, standing amid the shards of what had been my grandmother's antique vase. She was fully dressed, not in pajamas, and holding her phone like she'd been about to make a call. "Oh my goodness, Sophie," she exclaimed when she saw me. "I heard a noise and came down to check. I'm afraid I accidentally knocked over this vase in the dark." The vase had been sitting in the center of the kitchen island, nowhere near any path someone would take to investigate a noise. More importantly, the break pattern showed it had been thrown against the wall, not knocked over. "What kind of noise?" I asked calmly, noting that her phone screen showed 911 partially dialed. "I thought I heard someone trying to break in," Helen said, her voice taking on a tremulous quality. "I was so frightened. I was just about to call the police." It was a setup. Helen had planned to break something, call 911 claiming I had a violent episode, and have me arrested or committed. Her witnesses upstairs would back up whatever story she spun about my dangerous behavior. Unfortunately for Helen, I'd anticipated this exact scenario. "That's strange," I said,
pulling out my own phone. Because I have a comprehensive security system that records everything. Let me check the footage. Helen's face went pale as I opened the app that controlled my hidden cameras. Oh, that's not necessary. No, I insist. If someone was trying to break in, we need to see exactly what happened. I turned the phone screen toward her. Look at that. Perfect view of the kitchen from 2:25 a.m. onward. The video clearly showed Helen entering the kitchen, looking around to make sure she was alone, picking up the vase and deliberately hurling it against the wall. It also captured her dialing 911 before stopping when she heard me coming downstairs. This is very interesting, I said conversationally. It shows you intentionally destroying my property and attempting to file a false police report. Those are both felonies in Texas. Helen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time since I'd known her, she was completely speechless. Now, I continued, you have two choices. You can leave my house immediately and never contact my family again, or I can send this video to the police and let them sort out the criminal charges. You can't. This is Marcus. Helen's composure finally cracked completely as she called for her son. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs, looking confused and disheveled. What's going on? I heard glass breaking. Your mother intentionally broke my grandmother's vase and was about to call 911 to claim I did it. I have video evidence. Marcus looked between us, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and finally understanding. Mom, you didn't... She's lying, Helen shrieked, all pretense of dignity abandoned. She's manipulating you, can't you see that? She's dangerous, unstable, too... Stop. Marcus's voice carried an authority I hadn't heard from him in months. Just stop talking. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of Helen's witnesses, drawn by the commotion. Margaret, Linda, and Jennifer appeared in their robes, looking around at the broken glass and Helen's tear-streaked face. What happened? Margaret asked, nervously. Helen attempted to frame Sophie for property destruction and was about to file a false police report, Marcus said flatly. We have video evidence. The three women exchanged horrified glances. They'd come here to witness a veteran's breakdown, but instead they were watching their friend commit actual crimes. I think we should leave, Linda said quickly. This is clearly a family matter. Yes, I agreed. You should, and I'd suggest you be very careful about any stories you might be tempted to tell about tonight's events. Making false statements about someone's mental health can result in defamation lawsuits. As Helen's backup team fled upstairs to pack their bags, I turned my attention back to the main event. Helen was slumped against the kitchen counter, looking older and smaller than I'd ever seen her. Why? Marcus asked his mother. Why would you do this to Sophie? To us? For a moment, I thought Helen might finally tell the truth. Instead, she straightened and tried one last manipulation.
Because I love you, she said, reaching for Marcus with shaking hands. Because I've watched that woman change you, isolate you from your family. She's not good for you, Marcus. Can't you see how she's turned you against me? It was the wrong play. Marcus had just watched video evidence of his mother's criminal behavior, and she was still trying to blame me. No, Mom, he said, stepping away from her touch. You did this. You've been manipulating both of us for months, and I was too blind to see it. Helen's last gambit had failed. Her witnesses were fleeing, her son was finally seeing through her lies, and she was facing potential criminal charges for her failed setup. But I knew Helen Thompson well enough by now to realize she wouldn't go down without one final, desperate assault. You think you've won? She said to me, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper, but you have no idea what I'm capable of. This isn't over. Looking into her eyes, I saw something that made my combat-trained instincts scream danger. Helen wasn't just angry, she was completely unhinged. A person with nothing left to lose and a lifetime of manipulation skills was perhaps the most dangerous enemy I could face. Actually, I said calmly, I think it is over. Security cameras throughout the house recorded everything tonight, including that threat you just made.
along with all your other activities over the past few months. Helen's face went from fury to confusion. What other activities? I smiled the way I used to smile when calling in artillery strikes on enemy positions. Did you really think I wasn't documenting everything? The packages you sent? The phone calls with Marcus where you discussed strategies to undermine me? The unauthorized life insurance policy? The research into involuntary commitment procedures? Each revelation hit Helen like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed campaign had been monitored and recorded from the inside. "Game over, Helen," I said softly. "Check and mate."
The aftermath of Helen's failed setup was swift and decisive. Her 3 witnesses packed their bags and left before dawn, mumbling apologies and avoiding eye contact. Margaret Hartley actually had the nerve to ask if I'd consider not mentioning their involvement to anyone, as if being accessories to attempted fraud was just an embarrassing social faux pas. "That depends," I told her as she loaded her suitcase into her rental car, "on whether any of you ever contact me, my husband, or anyone else with false stories about my mental health." She nodded frantically and drove away like her tail was on fire. Helen herself was a different matter entirely. She'd locked herself in the guest bedroom and refused to come out, even when Marcus knocked and pleaded with her to talk. Through the door, we could hear her making phone calls, frantic, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever we approached. "She's calling lawyers," I told Marcus as we sat in our kitchen, sharing coffee in the ruins of what had been our marriage. "Probably trying to figure out if she can claim entrapment or illegal surveillance." Marcus looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. "Sophie, I am so sorry. I can't believe I mean, how did I not see what she was doing?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since discovering the scope of Helen's manipulation. "Because she's been doing this your whole life," I said. "You were conditioned to accept her control as normal." I pulled out my phone and opened the folder where I'd been collecting evidence. "Marcus, there's more you need to know. About your mother's financial situation, about the unauthorized life insurance policy, about her history with your ex-girlfriend, Sarah." For the next hour, I laid out everything I'd discovered: the mountain of debt Helen was hiding, her systematic destruction of her previous relationship, and the pattern of financial manipulation that had destroyed her late husband's business. I showed him the browser history from his own computer, documenting his research into involuntary commitment procedures. "She wasn't just trying to break us up," I explained. "She was building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could control my assets through you." Marcus stared at the evidence in horrified silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I almost helped her do it. I was actually researching how to have you committed." "I know." "You knew?" He looked up sharply. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I needed to understand the full scope of what we were dealing with. If I'd confronted you before gathering all the evidence, she would have just adapted her strategy." At that moment, Helen emerged from the guest room looking like a woman possessed. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her eyes held a manic gleam that made my combat instincts go on high alert. "I've spoken with my attorney," she announced, standing in our kitchen doorway like a general addressing defeated troops. "He says the recordings you made are inadmissible because this is a 2-party consent state." "Actually," I replied calmly, "Texas is a 1-party consent state. As long as one participant in a conversation consents to recording, it's perfectly legal. Since these are recordings of conversations in my own home where I was present, they're completely admissible." Helen's face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, rage, desperation, and finally, cold calculation. "Fine," she said, "but you can't prove I meant any harm. Everything I did was out of concern for my son's well-being." I opened my laptop and began playing audio files. First, the recording from the lake house where Helen and Marcus had discussed my episodes and how to document them. Then a phone conversation between Helen and one of her friends where she'd explicitly stated her plan to get rid of that military bitch and access my veteran benefits. "These recordings span several months," I said, as Helen's face grew progressively paler. They document conspiracy, fraud, attempted manipulation of mental health services, and financial crimes. My attorney estimates you're looking at somewhere between 5 and 15 years in federal prison. The mention of federal charges made Marcus look up sharply. Federal? Wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempting to defraud the VA benefit system all carry federal penalties. Plus, the unauthorized life insurance policy constitutes identity theft. Helen's legs seemed to give out, and she collapsed into a kitchen chair. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely defeated. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "I want you to leave my house, leave my marriage alone, and never contact my family again. I want you to sign a document admitting to your fraud and manipulation, and I want you to pay for the damage to my property and the emotional distress you've caused. And if I don't, then I turn all of this evidence over to the FBI Fraud Division and let them sort out the charges." Helen was trapped, and she knew it, but I'd underestimated just how desperate she'd become.
"You think you're so smart," she said, her voice rising to a dangerous pitch. "You think your little recording devices and your military training make you better than me? I built this family. I protected Marcus when his father abandoned us. I sacrificed everything to give him a good life. And you're just some broken soldier who's going to destroy everything I worked for." She was standing now, moving closer to me with an unstable energy that made my hand instinctively move toward the knife block on the counter. "Marcus doesn't love you," she continued, her voice becoming shrill. "He loves what you represent, some heroic fantasy about marrying a veteran. But when the novelty wears off, when he realizes how damaged you really are, he'll thank me for saving him from this mistake." "Mom, stop," Marcus said, but his voice sounded far away. Helen wasn't listening to him anymore. Her entire focus was on me, and I could see in her eyes that she'd crossed the line from manipulative to genuinely dangerous. "You know what your problem is, Sophie? You think because you survived some war, you can survive anything. But war is simple. You know who your enemies are. Family is more complicated. Family can destroy you from the inside, and you'll never see it coming." She was right about one thing. Family warfare was more complex than combat, but she'd made one crucial miscalculation. "You're absolutely right, Helen," I said, my voice carrying the deadly calm I'd used in Afghanistan when calling for backup. "Family can destroy you from the inside. That's why I made sure to document everything you've done, copy it to multiple secure locations, and share it with people who will make sure the truth comes out no matter what happens to me." Helen's eyes widened as the implications sunk in. She'd been so focused on manipulating Marcus and isolating me that she'd never considered I might have contingency plans. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and showed her a text thread with Danny, my lawyer Patricia, and Dr. Foster. If anything happens to me, if I'm injured, hospitalized, or simply disappear, they have instructions to immediately release everything to law enforcement and the media. For the first time in the entire confrontation, Helen Thompson looked genuinely afraid. And that's when she made her final, fatal mistake.
Helen lunged for the knife block. My military training kicked in before conscious thought could interfere. I sidestepped her desperate grab, caught her wrist, and used her own momentum to slam her hand against the counter. The knife she'd managed to grasp clattered to the floor as she cried out in pain and surprise. "Marcus, call 911, I said calmly, maintaining control of Helen's arm while she struggled. "Tell them we need police for an assault in progress." "Sophie, let me go!" Helen shrieked, trying to break free. "You're hurting me! Marcus, she's attacking me!" But Marcus wasn't moving to help his mother. He stood frozen, staring at the woman who'd raised him as she writhed in my grip, her face twisted with pure hatred. "Call them, Marcus," I repeated. applying just enough pressure to keep Helen immobilized without causing real damage. She just attempted assault with a deadly weapon. Helen's struggles became more frantic. "This is all your fault. I was protecting my family. You don't deserve him. You don't deserve any of this." As Marcus finally reached for his phone with shaking hands, I heard sirens in the distance. Someone had already called the police, probably a neighbor awakened by Helen's screaming. "Perfect timing," I said, maintaining my hold on Helen as red and blue lights flickered through our front windows. "The cavalry always arrives just when you need them." The next few minutes were controlled chaos. Austin police officers entered our home to find a combat veteran calmly restraining a hysterical woman who was shouting incoherent accusations about military conspiracies and ungrateful daughters-in-law. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to release her," the lead officer said, his hand resting on his weapon but his voice remaining professional. "Of course," I said, immediately letting go of Helen's arm and stepping back with my hands visible. She attempted to grab a knife from that block during an argument. I was defending myself. Helen immediately tried to rush me again, but the second officer intercepted her smoothly. "Ma'am, you need to calm down and step back." "She attacked me," Helen sobbed, cradling her wrist dramatically. "I'm the victim here. She's a dangerous veteran with PTSD. She's been threatening me all weekend." The officers exchanged glances. They'd clearly dealt with domestic disputes involving veterans before, and Helen's performance was hitting all the stereotypical notes that might have worked with less experienced responders. "Sir," the lead officer addressed Marcus, "can you tell us what happened here?" Marcus looked between his mother and me, and I could see him wrestling with a lifetime of conditioning. This was his moment to choose: support Helen's lies or tell the truth. My mother attempted to grab a knife during an argument with my wife. Sophie was defending herself. Helen's face went white. "Marcus, how can you, after everything I've done for you—" "Everything you've done to me," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference." The officer turned to me. "Ma'am, do you have any evidence of what occurred here tonight?" I pulled out my phone. "I have comprehensive security footage of the entire incident, plus recordings of the conversations that led up to it." "Recordings?" Helen shrieked. "She's been illegally recording private conversations." "Actually," the officer said, checking his notes, "Texas is a one-party consent state. If she was present for the conversations, the recordings are legal." As I showed the officers the security footage on my phone, Helen breaking my vase, attempting to call 911 with false reports, and finally lunging for the knife, I watched her realize that her final gambit had backfired spectacularly. "Based on what I'm seeing here," the lead officer said after reviewing the evidence, "we have attempted assault with a deadly weapon, destruction of property, and attempted filing of a false police report." Helen was handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car while she continued to shriek about military conspiracies and ungrateful families. As the officers prepared their report, I provided them with copies of all my evidence: the recordings, the unauthorized life insurance policy, documentation of Helen's systematic harassment campaign. "This is quite an extensive file," the detective who arrived later observed. "How long has this been going on?" "Months of systematic psychological abuse and manipulation. Tonight was just the culmination." The detective nodded grimly. "We'll need full statements from both of you, and this will likely be referred to the district attorney's office for prosecution." As the police cars pulled away with Helen inside, Marcus and I stood in our kitchen surrounded by the debris of our former life. Broken glass, scattered evidence files, and the knife Helen had tried to use against me. Physical manifestations of the violence that always lurked beneath her manipulative surface. "She's really gone," Marcus said wonderingly, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Yes," I confirmed, "but this isn't the end, Marcus. This is just the beginning of the legal process." Over the next few hours, as we cleaned up the kitchen and gave our statements to detectives, the full scope of Helen's crimes became clear. Beyond the immediate charges from tonight's incident, the district attorney was interested in pursuing federal fraud charges related to the life insurance policy and conspiracy charges for her systematic campaign to have me declared mentally incompetent. Your wife's documentation is remarkable, Detective Rodriguez told Marcus during his interview. Most domestic abuse cases involve he said, she said situations, but Mrs. Rivera has evidence of a pattern of manipulation that spans months. Marcus nodded numbly. I can't believe I fell for it. I actually helped her. Manipulation victims often become unwilling accomplices, the detective explained. Your mother is a skilled predator who's been perfecting these tactics for decades. As dawn broke over Austin, I found myself sitting on our back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in months, the house was quiet. No phone calls from Helen, no whispered conspiracies, no walking on eggshells around Marcus's fragile loyalty. Marcus joined me on the porch, looking haggard but somehow lighter than he had in ages. I owe you an apology, he said. More than an apology. I owe you my life. You don't owe me anything, I replied. You were a victim too. But I became her weapon against you. I documented your reactions, questioned your sanity, researched ways to have you committed. His voice broke. How can you ever forgive me? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself as I watched him finally stand up to his mother. The man sitting beside me was the person I'd fallen in love with before Helen's poison had turned him into a stranger. Because, I said finally, you chose the truth in the end. When it mattered most, you chose me over her. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. What happens now? To us, I mean. I considered the question carefully. Our marriage had been nearly destroyed by Helen's manipulation, but perhaps it wasn't too late to rebuild on a foundation of truth instead of lies. Now, I said, we figure out if we can build something real together without her influence, without her poison. Just us. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of Helen's reign of terror, I found something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The war was over. Now it was time to build the peace. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in Dallas, watching Helen Thompson be sentenced 4 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. The unauthorized life insurance policy had been the smoking gun that convinced prosecutors to pursue federal charges, while her attempted assault had sealed her fate on the state level. She looked smaller now, diminished by orange prison garb and the weight of her exposed crimes. As the judge read her sentence, Helen's eyes found mine across the courtroom. The hatred was still there, but tempered now by the resignation of someone who'd finally lost a game she'd been playing her entire life. Marcus sat beside me, his hand in mine, a simple gesture that represented months of hard work in couples therapy. Dr. Foster had recommended we see someone together to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than Helen's manipulated version of reality. The defendant will serve 48 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, the judge announced. She is also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $47,000 to cover the victim's legal fees, property damage, and emotional distress. As Helen was led away in shackles, I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only relief that the threat she'd represented was finally neutralized. Outside the courthouse, Marcus and I stood in the Texas sunshine, breathing free air for what felt like the first time in years. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I can finally exhale," I said. "What about you?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching the traffic flow past the courthouse steps. Relieved, guilty, free. He turned to me with eyes that were clearer than they'd been since I'd known him.
Grateful that you fought for us even when I didn't. The month since Helen's arrest hadn't been easy. Marcus had struggled with guilt over his role in his mother's campaign, while I'd worked through my own anger about his betrayal. Dr. Foster had guided us through the difficult process of rebuilding trust, helping Marcus understand how thoroughly he'd been manipulated, while helping me see the difference between the man Helen had created and the man he actually was. I keep thinking about that night, Marcus said, as we walked to our car, when she went for the knife. If you hadn't been trained to handle that situation... But I was trained. That's the point. My military service didn't make me broken or unstable. It made me strong enough to survive what she tried to do to us. Rachel Thompson had become an unexpected ally during the legal proceedings. She testified about Helen's manipulation tactics and provided additional evidence of her mother's pattern of destructive behavior. With Helen in prison, Rachel was finally free to pursue her own life without fear of financial retaliation. I should have warned you earlier, she had told me during one of our coffee meetings, but I was so afraid of her. She had this way of making you feel like crossing her would destroy everything you cared about. You couldn't have known how far she was willing to go, I'd replied. Even I was surprised by the knife. Danny Walsh had been instrumental in helping me process the aftermath of Helen's attack. As a fellow veteran who dealt with his own family challenges, he understood the unique complexities of defending yourself against someone who was supposed to be family. The hardest part, he had said during one of our conversations, is that people expect you to just forgive and forget because family is family. But toxic family members are often more dangerous than strangers because they know exactly how to hurt you. Now, as Marcus and I drove back to Austin, I reflected on how much had changed since that night when Helen had told me to sleep on my own couch. The house felt different now, lighter, calmer, truly ours for the first time. We'd redecorated together, choosing colors and furniture that reflected our shared taste rather than Helen's imposed aesthetic. Marcus had also made significant changes in his own life. He'd started individual therapy to work through the psychological damage of growing up under Helen's control. He'd reconnected with old friends that Helen had systematically driven away over the years. Most importantly, he'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics and trust his own judgment. I keep thinking about that night, Marcus said as we pulled into our driveway, when she went for the knife. If you hadn't been trained to handle that situation... But I was trained. That's the point. My military service didn't make me broken or unstable. It made me strong enough to survive what she tried to do to us. Rachel Thompson had become an unexpected ally during the legal proceedings. She had testified about Helen's manipulation tactics and provided additional evidence of her mother's pattern of destructive behavior. With Helen in prison, Rachel was finally free to pursue her own life without fear of financial retaliation. I should have warned you earlier, she had told me during one of our coffee meetings, but I was so afraid of her. She had this way of making you feel like crossing her would destroy everything you cared about. You couldn't have known how far she was willing to go, I'd replied. Even I was surprised by the knife. Danny Walsh had been instrumental in helping me process the aftermath of Helen's attack. As a fellow veteran who dealt with his own family challenges, he understood the unique complexities of defending yourself against someone who was supposed to be family. The hardest part, he had said during one of our conversations, is that people expect you to just forgive and forget because family is family. But toxic family members are often more dangerous than strangers because they know exactly how to hurt you. Now, as Marcus and I drove back to Austin, I reflected on how much had changed since that night when Helen had told me to sleep on my own couch. The house felt different now. Lighter, calmer, truly ours for the first time. We'd redecorated together, choosing colors and furniture that reflected our shared taste rather than Helen's imposed aesthetic. Marcus had also made significant changes in his own life. He'd started individual therapy to work through the psychological damage of growing up under Helen's control. He'd reconnected with old friends that Helen had systematically driven away over the years. Most importantly, he'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics and trust his own judgment. "I want to show you something," Marcus said, as we pulled into our driveway. He led me to the backyard where I discovered he'd been working on a surprise project, a beautiful garden space with a memorial section dedicated to my military service, not the sterile display that Helen wanted to erase, but a living tribute with plants native to Afghanistan and a bench engraved with the names of soldiers from my unit who hadn't made it home. "I wanted to honor that part of your life," he said quietly, "not hide it or treat it like something to be ashamed of." I felt tears sting my eyes as I read the names of my fallen comrades carved into the stone bench. "Marcus, this is beautiful." "You saved my life," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "The least I could do was honor the experiences that made you strong enough to do it."
That evening, we hosted a small celebration dinner for the friends who had supported us through Helen's campaign. Danny and his wife Carmen, Zoe Campbell, Dr. Foster, Patricia the lawyer, and Rachel all gathered around our dining room table, the same table where Helen had tried to conduct her intervention just 6 months earlier. To Sophie, Danny raised his glass, for proving that Marines don't retreat, they just advance in a different direction. To second chances, added Marcus, his eyes meeting mine across the table, and to the people brave enough to fight for them. As our friends laughed and shared stories around the table, I felt a profound sense of completion. Helen's war against my marriage was over, and we had won not through violence or revenge, but through truth, preparation, and the courage to stand up for what was right. Later that night, as Marcus and I cleaned up the kitchen together, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. From the naive young woman who'd tried so hard to win Helen's approval, to the combat-trained veteran who'd recognized an enemy and neutralized the threat. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked, as if reading my thoughts. I considered the question seriously. The months of psychological warfare, the fear, the pain of watching my marriage nearly crumble, all of it had been Helen's doing, but it had also revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed. "No regrets," I said finally. "Helen taught me something valuable, even though she didn't mean to." "What's that?" "That the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil against strangers. They're fought in your own home, for your own dignity, against people who should love you but choose to destroy you instead." I looked around our peaceful kitchen, free now from Helen's toxic presence, and smiled. And sometimes, the most important victory is simply refusing to surrender who you are. As we turned off the lights and headed upstairs to our bedroom in our house, with our rules, I felt the deep satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Helen Thompson had declared war on a woman she thought was broken and defenseless. Instead, she'd awakened a warrior who refused to be defeated. And in the end, that had made all the difference.